welcome to the Lowdown. My name's Dax Dixon, and I'm joined here on Monday with my co-host Lindsey Brock, as well as special guest star Teresa Talton. Everybody have a good weekend.
Very
Great.
good.
Awesome.
Well,
Hot in the summer.
yeah, so today's emergency funds, I started learning how to cook pizzas this weekend because I have a pizza oven attachment, and that there was a few emergencies along the way. Mine turned out terribly. The one I cooked for my wife was actually pretty decent though, so I got that going for me. So as I mentioned, today we're going to start talking about emergency funds. So Teresa, we wanted you to join us because you're on our financial planning team here, and I think you believe that emergency fund is probably step one in financial security. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the first thing that we do in financial planning when we're talking to somebody, especially young people starting out.
Yeah. So why does somebody need an emergency fund?
So an emergency fund in my mind is something that you know is going to happen. Anything mechanical is going to break, right? Uncle Murphy visits. So if you have a house, things are going to break in it. If you have a car, things are going to break on it. Sometimes you may have to travel last minute for something unexpected, and so you want to have some money set aside in order to be able to not have to put that on a credit card, whatever the expense may be. So it's, to me, things that you know are going to happen, you just don't know exactly how much they're going to cost or exactly when they're going to happen. So have some of that
So
sitting on the side ready for that.
what's the difference then between just regular cash that you might hold for other goals and your emergency fund?
Your goals are, you're building money in those. So if you're talking about like a vacation, something that you're planning for would not be considered an emergency fund. So if it's something you can save for, like, your property taxes are due once a year and maybe you don't escrow them, so you can save up for that. Or if it's a big vacation that your family wants to take, that's again something you could save up for. The emergency fund is for things that you have saved for it, you just don't have exactly, you don't really know exactly in your mind what it's going to be for. You just know stuff's going to happen and you want to have this bulk, this surplus to pull from. Does that help?
So Lindsey, in your mind, what is an emergency fund? I think we kind of dove right in without kind of defining, when we say an emergency fund, what exactly are we talking about?
Yeah. I think of it as a true emergency. So again, Teresa was talking about not something a goal or something fun necessarily. So if I'm traveling for a vacation or a friend's wedding or for something to see family for enjoyment, that's something I'm going to save up for and I'm going to take my time. I'll have that in my regular savings. But an emergency fund is something that I might know is coming at some point because something might break, or it might even be something that I don't know is coming and is a true emergency, right? There's a hurricane that knocks out a post on my front porch or something, and I didn't expect it, but I need to replace it because it's dangerous or it's something that I need to tackle right away. Car brakes are another good example. You might know that you need to replace your brakes eventually, but you hope it's not soon. And then you go and get your car looked at and something's squealing and it's those brakes. So having that dollar amount set aside that you don't have to charge to a credit card or ask to borrow money from someone, or especially pull from your savings goals, is really helpful because then you kind of that you have that emergency fund set aside. You can use those dollars and then replenish them after you're done with that said emergency. But it's something that doesn't really hack into your long-term savings goals by either providing for more debt or taking away from those long savings.
Yeah. So I think just to kind of summarize here, long-term savings or investment accounts. Those are actively invested in, whether stocks, bonds, or something else. When we're talking about emergency funds, it's distinct from maybe your day-to-day or month-to-month cash needs that will be in something like a checking account and maybe in a savings account or a money market fund, something that's really accessible in case of emergency with low levels of fluctuation in account value.
Yeah, I think
And
that's a really important point, Dex, actually, because there are some account types with forms of lockups, right? So a CD, it's not really a lockup, but you might have an interest deduction there if you take it early. So that might not be a great place for your emergency savings. Your emergency fund should be something that's really in a general savings account. You can get next day or
Yeah,
that day.
accessibility is key here when talking about emergency, and something that kind of both of you hit on is like unforeseen circumstances. Sometimes you know that those are going to come up, such as maintenance on your car. You don't know when you're going to need new tires. You do know you're going to need them, but sometimes you don't know that things are going to happen. So to give an example, when I first started working, and there's a huge stigma around credit cards, but sometimes people use credit cards not for frivolous spending because they have to, because life comes at you fast sometimes, right? And so I was playing in a work basketball league, and I didn't necessarily, I guess I didn't have to play in a work basketball league, but um, I tore my ACL during the work basketball league. And this was like no emergency savings. I was basically right out of college, living paycheck to paycheck. And I think my deductible, I had really good company insurance at the time, but my deductible was still a couple of grand, and I didn't have that kind of cash just laying around. So I did carry a credit card balance for about a year and a half to pay that off. And that's another circumstance. I don't know that I'm going to tear my ACL in the future. I hope I don't again, because it's very uncomfortable. But there's times when you even have to plan for things that you do not expect to happen. And unfortunately, I had to use a credit card debt back then. But I will say, kind of our next question, I guess I have for you, Teresa, is kind of the value of having an emergency fund to kind of your long-term savings. Because I know for me, like after I established that emergency fund, it made it like I didn't have to go into credit card debt, which set me back from an interest standpoint, pay more a month than I needed to. I didn't have to, tap in or cut back on all the life stuff because I had an emergency fund there. So I don't know what to you, when you're thinking about from a financial planning perspective, is a true value of an emergency fund.
I think that's a valid point, that you're not sort of always catching up, right? Because if you're having to put your expenses on a credit card as your emergency fund, then you're always playing catch up. You're always a month behind. And so when you think, oh, I'm going to have some money, next month I'll have money that I can put away in my emergency fund, but then your credit card bill comes due. So I think it's important to make sure that, or I think that definitely helps get you on the right foot, kind of get you out of that cycle. It's a valid point that you bring up there. As far as having a lump sum on the side, I mean, I think that also brings a lot of peace of mind to people. Just kind of knowing that no matter what's being thrown your way, you have something there that you can pull from. And of course, it also lets you now take the money that you maybe were paying off the credit card with, and now you can put it into your Roth IRA or put it into your 401k. So it allows you to start that next step of financial planning, which is building your investments.
I have a question. How much would we typically recommend an individual who's either, on their own, they're their own dependent, that's it. They have an emergency savings, or I know some of our listeners are young families where they might have dependents, kids, even pets could have emergencies, or even maybe two working individuals who are together as partners. Does that change the dynamic at all, whether, it's one single person, whether it's a family, whether it's a couple that both work or one work?
Yeah, I think once we kind of get out of that initial just survival mode, which to me is like right when you come out of college or right when you start off on your own and you're having to like pay first and last month's rent, and maybe you're having to buy a car and all of these things that kind of are very expensive when you're first starting off. But once you kind of settle into some regular expenses, and you're able to build, and maybe in your 30s, 40s, or later in your 30s, 40s, then we talk about emergency savings in terms of like so many months worth of your living expenses. But before we get to that, I think when you're in those very young years and trying to accumulate, we don't necessarily talk about it in months worth of living expenses. We talk about it in dollar figures. So you maybe set some realistic goals, like maybe it's $200, and then you're trying to build up to $500, and then you set a goal for $1,000. And so instead of 1 month's worth of expenses, you're just trying to get to this dollar amount. But after you kind of get past that stage in your life, then we're talking about usually, we all say 3 to 6 months worth of living expenses for people who are in their working years. But like you say, Lindsay, that does depend on like how many people in the household are working. So if you have a single income household, whether that's because it's just one person who lives in the household, or whether it's someone who is married or in, has a partner, but only one of them works outside the home. Normally, we want them to have a little bit more buffer because you have a lot riding on that one income. So in those situations, these are just rules of thumb, but that would be more leaning toward the 6 months worth of living expenses. And if you have two people in the household working, then you have a little bit less liability, right? If one person loses their job, you still have another person who probably doesn't lose their job. So in those situations, maybe 3 months is enough. But that's like going to really depend on personality too, because there are, a lot of people who, to them, 3 months worth just sitting there in cash is burning a hole in their pocket, and they really feel like they need to be investing that. A lot of that is gender, driven too. Men tend to love to invest it, and they don't want it just sitting there safe and sound. And women tend to like to have even more cash than like what we're recommending sometimes. So yeah,
So
it does depend on.
you would
like,
say kind of rule of thumb is the more obligation you have, probably the closer you should be to 6 months. And as you approach it, retirement is probably extended out a little bit more from there. An obligation might be mouths to feed, or if you're the higher income earner in the household, there's a lot more pulling on your income. But if you're young and single, especially, you can probably lean closer to that 3 month mark. But I think kind of when you said to start out with, just hitting dollar figure numbers to kind of get you jump started is a good idea. Because one thing they don't talk about, Teresa, that you alluded to, is there's a lot of startup costs to launching, whether that's a job out of high school or college. I know that I'm recently married, Lindsay. You're obviously on having your second child soon. When I got married, we had a registry and went through all that. I was like, this is much more appropriate when I was 21, 22, because I actually didn't have dishes at that point, and now I do. And so, again, another expense that you have coming out of college that you really don't think about. So, one last thing that I wanted to touch on today, because I know there was a difference of opinion during our pre-notes. And what exactly do we use an emergency fund for? What would qualify as an emergency? And what do you guys think is more of a, maybe you should budget for that kind of scenario?
I mean, I think about as I have continued to move up in my career, my husband and I have continued to, we both work, but we now have 1.5 children because I am pregnant, and we have a dog. And so those are obligations, right? So I can plan around the obligations for my children and my dog and my house and my car. But what I can't plan for are those true unexpected expenses that might be like a broken leg. So I think that kind of maybe sounds a little bit like the ACL story that you talked about, Dax, but I mean, my toddler is everywhere. I hope that we do not have to worry about any broken anything anytime soon, but I know that toddlers they find a way to hurt themselves. And so I want to make sure that I'm not going to have to tap into, credit card debt or anything for that. Or even at this point, I have a pretty high deductible plan, and I am trying to save up and work up my way to get a larger balance in my health savings account. So I actually am not touching my health savings account. That's a whole other topic we can talk about another time, but I'm investing in that
spoiler
for the
alerts,
future.
health savings accounts are coming later.
Yes, no, that's not something to worry about, but I don't want to touch mine right now for other reasons. So I would like to pay if there are any expenses for medical needs that are reasonable-ish for us to pay out of pocket. I want to be able to have that on hand. So my emergency fund for my family is kind of large because, again, toddlers and pit bull.
Yeah. But so you'd say things like medical emergencies, maybe vehicle emergencies, definitely an emergency fund, but things like your daughter's daycare bill, probably not an emergency. That should probably be budgeted for. Or even like your daughter's 2-year-old birthday party, again, not an emergency.
Definitely.
Well, there might be some emergencies there if you're hosting like 10 other toddlers, but that's certainly
But
that could be on their
I
parents.
file that under the medical emergency. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. What about you, Teresa?
I would just add to that, another thing I think sometimes people don't think about is if you do become disabled in some way, and sometimes disability policies don't kick in for 3 months or 6 months. So it's nice to have, whether or not you've lost your job or whether or not you just can't work, and maybe there's some interim while you're going through some physical therapy or something. It's nice to have that on the sidelines to make sure that you can get through that next, period of time. Hopefully it's a short period of time before you go back to work. So it's, that also constitutes emergency fund. And then, I would just add like the fund, Lindsay already, talked a good bit about this, but the fun stuff is not really an emergency. My child wanting to go on their senior trip to Paris is not an emergency. Us wanting to travel or any of those fun things, that's something that if we have, a year to plan for it, or a wedding, someone's child is getting married, that's something that you typically have time to plan for. So that would not be an emergency.
Gotcha. All right. Final question. How do you budget for an emergency? Where do you put it, I guess? Do you put it all in a savings account, or do you have it linked to your brokerage account? I guess personally, where do you have your savings?
And I
Or your
want to tack
emergency?
on to that question and ask, because Teresa, again, Dax, we've talked about, we're all in a little bit of different flavors of our lives, and Teresa has teenage children. So I want to know how, and if you're talking to them about emergency planning and savings and their cash on hand and what they, so I would love you to answer that question too.
Okay. So I guess on the first question, like I think Lindsay, I think one of you said it earlier, we want to make sure that's in a safe and sound, just really boring savings account somewhere. That's like wherever you bank, if you have a savings account, you can stick it there. You have FDIC insurance up to $250,000. That's going to cover it more than likely. So, you don't have to open anything special for that. It's not going to be invested. Did that answer your question, Dax?
Yes.
Okay. And then as far as my kids go, so my daughter just recently got a job. She's 16, and she uses her money mainly because she likes to go out to eat. So we're still in the budgeting spending side of that. And she says, well, I spend less than I make. And I'm like, okay, but let's look at percentage wise, right? So that's an activity we're actually going to be doing in the next couple of days. But my son is in college, and so he had been working and he has been saving for quite a few years. And so he has a savings account. And what we did was sort of figure out like how much, because he's on the hook for certain expenses like books, parking, some of the, college expenses we've shifted over to him. Some kids may have to pay their own car insurance, gas, things of that nature. So whatever, they have to pay for, and specifically for my son, we added up how much it would cost him in a year, because he kind of works sporadically, in the summer and then maybe one of the semesters, but maybe not another one. And so we kind of added up how much he is going to spend over the course of the year. And we had him keep that amount in a savings account. And he had more than that. So he opened a Roth IRA and he put money into that above and beyond his dollar amount. For him, it was $1,000. That's what he needed, like, to keep in his savings account. So, it's going to be different for everyone. And even some kids want, like my daughter doesn't really want to invest it. She hasn't really quite grasped that concept. She wants it available to her all the time because she might buy something expensive. So, we're working on that, but we'll get there.
To answer your first question, Dax, for me, I have a couple different layers. So I have, my checking account monies, which is very little, and it's really just enough to kind of cover the monthly bills. I really keep it in there a minimal amount, just in case I go over a little. Then I have attached to my checking account, I have a savings. So again, like Teresa was saying, a plain old vanilla, very boring savings account, and that's really the emergency fund. That's meant to be really anything in a true emergency I can grab quickly and not have to worry about it. I actually have it in a brick and mortar bank, which is odd for me because I do everything online. I know. So that is all I have in a brick and mortar. It's a big box bank down the street, and that's purely.
Do you go get the envelopes full of cash on Fridays for your weekend spending?
No, but I do use the tube that shoots up in the drive-through from.
Yeah.
So I have that, and those are really my quickest cash resources. But for my longer term savings, I have layers that are in online banking institutions that don't have a brick and mortar. There I can get higher interest rates, but those are really going to be for those planned savings. So travel, house expenses, big car, if I plan on getting a new car soon, those are going to be the ones where I can hopefully earn a little bit more interest. And I might even take a little bit more risk by investing in some short-term bonds. That's a whole other topic of conversation. But again, I have different layers in there of cash-like vehicles working my way up in
Yeah, so
how available.
your cash accounts are like that meme from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia with the red yarn going every which way to try to
Yes,
figure it out.
yes.
So mine's a lot simpler. So I have with a national online brokerage firm that is also has affiliate bank. I do my checking, and same thing. I keep very minimal checking in there, but I have an attached account to my checking account that's a brokerage account where I keep all of my side cash. And my true emergency cash, I've been moved into an money market account, and then there's cash also sitting in the brokerage if I want to invest that, or if I'm planning a vacation or anything else that's a planned expense. I'll let cash accumulate there for that. So very simple, much simpler system, but it's not enveloped out nicely, so I have to kind of have some mental check marks for it, right? So anywho, I think that is all we had for today. Any parting wisdom from you, Teresa?
No, I think we covered the topics.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for your
All right.
time. I did notice that none of us did say actual physical cash in envelopes under our mattresses.
No, or gold or anything else, right? So, all right. Well, thanks again for joining us, Teresa, and until next time.
Thanks for having me.